Imagine for a moment, we live in a world where everyone and every company knows about their transformative purpose. And together, we are creating a better world than how we found it. Peter Birch has worked in management roles in healthcare organizations for over 15 to 20 years. Big ones and small ones, innovative startups, and slow-moving beasts, he's seen all different kinds. Pete has experienced firsthand the exciting developments and the frustrating stagnation of all the ups and downs in health, as well as the impact to businesses, investors, doctors, and patients. He is an experienced healthcare executive with a proven track record of helping health tech startups in APAC lift into scale of phase and beyond. A creator and host of Talking HealthTech, a podcast featuring conversations with influential doctors, developers, and decision makers playing in the Australian HealthTech scene. He is a company director at Meta Optima, creating intelligent technologies to help doctors detect and treat skin cancer. He is also a company director of the Medical Software Industry Association, representing the software vendors of the healthcare industry in Australia. Welcome to Transformative Purpose. My first guest on this podcast is Peter Birch. I met Peter over 10 years ago when we were both doing our MBA in Australia. And since then, Pete has gone off and done some very interesting things. Last time I heard, he has built a community and ecosystem around health tech in Australia and is currently helping many companies and people to improve the healthcare system in APAC. Welcome, Peter.
Hey, Aaron. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm amazing, mate. Thank you so much. It's great to be able to chat. It's been so long since we caught up, in Sydney doing our MBAs with, bright eyes and bushy tails and looking to change the world. So, yeah, it's great to connect.
Yeah, indeed. I think it's been more than 10 years.
Yeah. Time flies, right? Time flies. Let me say a little bit about myself. So I, have worked within within the healthcare and health tech space, for the past 10, 15 years, really focused on the operations and general management side of things. More recently, I've started up Talking HealthTech, which can obviously go into in more detail a bit later, but at a high level, really passionate about connecting others within the industry of technology and healthcare in Australia, so quite specific about how best to utilize technology to deliver better patient outcomes and improve the healthcare services in Australia.
That's fantastic. I still remember the days where we were doing the operation management module at the MBA. I still remember, how passionate you were in operations.
Yeah, that's very true. Actually, yeah, you had that firsthand insight. And so I've always, and it's a really interesting point because I talk so much about the doing and the getting it done and making things happen within, when we talk about Talking Health Tech. And so that's one thing that I'm quite passionate about as well, is the doing. And so it's one thing to have grand aspirational vision for where things need to be, and that's also really important to have. But at various points within my career, often got frustrated in look, that's fantastic, we have the vision and where things need to be, but where's the doing? Who's actually executing? And so I found myself very much involved in the making stuff happen side of things and being the doer, as I've been described a lot in my career. So being able to apply that at an industry level across, the ecosystem, as you say, is something that I'm particularly passionate about.
Yeah, glad to hear. Hey, if it's okay with you, Pete, I want to talk to you about some of these emerging trends that you've seen out of health tech. We can talk about Australia and APAC, some of the challenges that you see faced by the incumbents. We could talk about hospitals, clinics, doctors, patients, and some of the interesting innovation and successful companies you've seen in this space. And perhaps, I guess, your crystal ball as to what are some of the emerging trends and where do the opportunities lie in the next, 5 to 10 years?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So I did a bit of research, and this gig that you're currently doing it seemed to me that you started out as a podcast, but it quickly evolved into a community. Can you just tell me how did that happen?
Yeah, sure. So look, and by way of background, so whilst doing all of the management stuff within healthcare, another thing that I was doing on the side, years ago, this is before you have kids, you've got these things called hobbies, which I vaguely remember, which I had this hobby of community radio. And that was, long before podcasting was on my radar, and that was fun within my local community, and, definitely not a business or anything, but something I was particularly passionate about, having those conversations and connecting others and sharing learning. So I've always kind of had this undercurrent of that whole kind of world. And as I was learning more around healthcare and technology and having a lot of conversations with interesting people, I kind of and was becoming more and more interested in podcasting over that time. That's how I became, I consumed a lot of my media and information was through podcasts. I began searching for podcasts on healthcare technology in Australia, and there just wasn't anything. And it wasn't even really too much at the time. This is a couple of years ago. It wasn't even too much about healthcare in Australia, on podcasts. So look, I know how to create something and put together shows. I've got a decent network. How about I do 10 or 20 episodes and see how it goes? It sounds like a bit of fun and maybe a nice way to connect with some others in the industry that I haven't spoken to for a while. Because I had so many interesting conversations with these people, but they obviously just weren't recorded. So that started, and I just started this podcast as a fortnightly thing with no real kind of big grand vision on what it might become. It certainly wasn't started with the intention of even being monetized, let alone being my full-time thing. So, but and, when I started it, I thought, maybe there's only a finite amount of conversations that I could have, because it was quite a niche of a niche, like health tech in Australia. It's not a small country, but again, it's not the biggest by far. And there's only so many players, I thought. But then pulling the thread and starting having those conversations, realizing that my blinkers were very much on, because there was only one aspect I was focused on at the time. I had a background in general practice, like outpatient technology at the time, and then realizing there's, it's connected to hospitals and the allied health space and specialists, but then, beyond outpatient and even beyond the delivery of healthcare, you've got the VC, like venture capital and raising capital, and then the stories and the passion of founders, and generally the concepts of entrepreneurship and innovation and all those interesting things. So there's an infinite amount of conversations that can be had on the podcast. And more recently, a lot of the themes have been around how the public and private sectors connect together and how to then build all that. So it just continued to evolve. And then so that was just the podcast. And, opportunities came up where organizations wanted to sponsor, and that was great, from my side to be able to, keep the thing going, because there are costs involved in running a podcast. It then continued to go from there, where I wanted to make sure that all of the podcasts were being, captured and could be found easily. So I had the website, and then it just kept going. So building a thing on the website for companies to have their own presence, like a directory, and then started to monetize that. And that's when I realized, look, there's an opportunity for, more here, not just for companies to promote their thing, like as a directory listing, but to solve this problem that I've seen for a while within the industry where I operated, which was that when you're operating in healthcare, trying to solve problems with technology, it's such an isolating industry, and you feel like you're operating by yourself. So, and, like I mentioned, it's quite specific. So, when you're operating in the space that can be challenging by yourself, it's really hard to stay motivated. So the need for community is there. So I just started this forum on the website, and then opened up for individuals to join. And there was a great response from a lot of people, individuals, whether they're starting their own thing or even from outside of Australia, which I did not expect. A lot of individuals from outside of Australia joining the community. So it's a premium pay community where they can then connect with others within the Australian space because they wanted to learn more about it. So I became kind of this beacon for, if you want to learn more about health technology in Australia, get in touch with Pete from Talking HealthTech. So that's where we're at now. And fast forward to today, I just hired our first nearly full-time employee as an operations
Congratulations.
manager, to do things on the day today. So it's become, it's a business. It's a full-time business where we've got a lot of cogs turning, and it's really interesting to see it go from, this neat little passion project on the side to my full-time thing.
Well, thank you for sharing your journey. It's definitely interesting to hear. I think not just for health tech industry, I think a lot of us see issues across all industries, but there aren't enough visionary leaders like yourself who would actually, go up and do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting. I struggled with the idea of taking that leap twice, or a few times in my career. Firstly, going from, because I started my career after the MBA. So when we last spoke, I guess I was over 10 years ago, I was...
You were still at Medibank, right?
Yeah, I was at Medibank at the time, right? Yeah. And so large organization, good support network, and I guess that security of being employed within a large organization. And the opportunity came up after a few years. Like I moved from Medibank to Sonic, so another big organization. Opportunity came up to move into a startup, pre-revenue, and that's quite a very different environment, right? And so I the amount of pros and cons lists and mind maps and stuff that I drew to try and help me come up with a conclusive decision about what I should do, yeah, you need to go through that process, but there's at a point where you still kind of decide, look, I just got to take a leap and do it. Like if you're really interested, there's no way to know how it'll go. But I think I reconciled that in my mind, or at least hindsight's great, because I realized afterwards that the security that you feel in a large organization, it's not real. I mean, there's no more security in a large organization being employed than there is being in a startup. Yes, do your due diligence to determine that they've got a decent amount of cash flow and enough kind of sustainability, and it's potentially a viable thing that you're interested in. But when you're in a big organization, you're relying on a spreadsheet sometimes, and that security can quickly go away, particularly as a lot of people have seen, when unprecedented things happen. So I followed that journey again in the startup life, and then when eventually the time came to go from being employed in a startup scale-up company to then going out and doing my own thing, it was the same kind of decision making, but no amount of mind maps and kind of pros and cons lists and even conversations would give me a definitive answer. It just needed to be a jump and do it. And I had I was lucky to be able to do both things at the same time, but that's only sustainable for so long because I was giving my all to my, employer, but then, eating into a lot of family time on the weekends and after hours. But you do that because you're passionate about it as a side project, but then pulled the switch and made the move. It was a particularly harder thing to do as I'm a bit older now. I've got kids and a family and a mortgage. And so if you're, I used to think if I was in my 20s, this would be a much easier decision because it's just yourself. And, if it didn't work out, then I could, live on 2-minute noodles and, rent somewhere or whatever. But when you've got a support network, it can be really hard to make a call to follow something that you're passionate about. But I would strongly recommend those that are thinking about that, yes, do your due diligence and work it out, but really think about that. The worst thing that can happen, the thing that's stopping you from doing it, really kind of stress test that and decide whether it's really as bad as you're making it out to be. Because there's always, if you've got qualifications or if you've got a support network or if there are options around, it's never as bad as you think it's going to be. Like, it's much better to take a chance and then kind of rebuild from there rather than deciding, 10 years, 15 years down the track, whether you have this opportunity.
You regret you didn't do it.
Yeah. So that's what I've learned through that process.
Okay. Was there any memorable conversation you've had which made you kind of pull the switch?
Yeah, look, I had a pretty similar conversation. The advice that I just gave then, I kind of have had from just mentors locally who gave me some pretty similar advice. And that, and it's just pulling from different conversations from different people I've engaged with, and, also doing my learning externally as well. There's a lot of good online mentors that even if you don't have a support network yourself, there's some good resources online and people doing similar things that listen to a lot of podcasts that you feel, because they're a good medium to be able to hear from other people's experiences and take that perspective, put your feet in the shoes of someone else, and then hopefully put that in context for you. And maybe that'll help you look at a problem from a new angle and then help you make a more informed decision. So yeah, definitely put the feelers out. There's never been a better time to, all of the information that we'll ever need is available to us on the internet to learn from someone else that might be in a similar situation. So get out there and get amongst it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. My experience has been similar, and I found that if you surround yourself with people that have a similar mindset, sort of positive mindset as you, your chance of success is higher, and your chance of taking that leap of faith is also higher.
Yeah. What is it that there's that, I'm going to butcher this analogy, but what is it that you're the average of the 5 people that you spend the most amount of time with or something like that? I think there's a lot.
That's right. Yeah. So I remember in the introduction, you mentioned about improving patient outcomes. I just want to ask you, why do you think health tech is interesting? Why now is a good time? And what is wrong with the industry that you're seeing?
Yeah, sure. Look, firstly, I think, because I'm very much focused on Australia. If I look at Australia, healthcare is not necessarily broken in Australia. It's a good healthcare system, but there's a lot to be still addressed and there's a lot to be improved. I think that, we're all patients. We've all got, or we're all carers within the space. And so we've all operated it on a day-to-day. I think with this is all pre-COVID as well, aging population, and as a society generally becoming more unhealthy, like increased chronic disease, other kind of issues. These types of issues aren't in areas where people are affluent and have access to all the information they ever need necessarily. They're in areas of communities that need more attention. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here in Australia, or regional remote areas. So, it's not an issue necessarily of willingness, but it might be accessibility. So with, our healthcare providers in Australia are generally, they will centralise into capital cities and everything. So when you're in a big country like Australia, being in the regional and remote areas can be hard to access healthcare. And so technology is obviously can be an answer to a lot of this. But what I find such an interesting challenge, and we talk about a lot on the podcast, is how technology can sometimes be the problem and the solution. So, we've talked a lot about, more recently with COVID and the pressure on healthcare workers and the wellness of them, and the need for technology to improve, because, they're all using electronic medical records or systems to be able to capture patient information, or utilizing tools to help with the diagnosis. If these tools aren't useful or well integrated or interoperable and helping the cause, if they're creating more issues, then that's become part of the problem. So I think technology's got a big role to play, not just in improving the accessibility of healthcare generally in Australia, but also improving some of the problems that it's created, in the fact that there are a lot of silos of information in Australia. There are things that are systemically within Australia. We've got things like the My Health record, where it's supposed to be a centralised record and a source of truth. And in theory, that sounds great and that's run by the government, but there's low adoption and the utility of it is relatively low. So there's a lot to be done. And lastly, here in Australia as well, an area that's becoming increasingly important is there was a recent Royal Commission investigation into aged care in Australia, and a big part of that, a big recommendation off the back of the Royal Commission, was the need for greater connection between GP primary care and the aged care space, utilising technology. So I think the need for more information to be available across different areas, not just in healthcare but in aged care, to help improve a healthier society is really important. So that's some of the stuff that we talk about on the podcast.
Yeah, aging population is definitely a big thing. I think for the first time in our history, median age is going to reach over 30 years of age. Globally, right? Yeah. And every one of us is, using our smartphone or our smart devices to track our heart rate and how healthy we are.
Yeah, that's right. It's going to be really cool.
So when I work with other industry leaders, one thing that pops up a lot is managing their legacy infrastructure. And it seems to me, when you were describing some of the issues facing this industry, there's also a lot of legacy infrastructure within the health tech space, which is slowing down the innovation. Is that true?
Oh man, tell me about it. So we've got, within the GP space, for those not familiar with healthcare, it blows a lot of people's minds that the main form of communication is still fax machines. So
do they still exist?
No, like legit, like they have to in healthcare for some bizarre, like I know the excuses that are provided, but as the only form of secure communication that can't, I think that's just totally crazy, right? But as an industry, that's what we still rely upon. And yeah, sure, we've digitized the fax, but I mean, come on, like the secure messaging solutions that exist don't connect with each other. They're not built on common frameworks and standards that mean that someone sending a message from one provider can't send it to another. It would be like if I was on one telephone provider like Vodafone here in Australia, but I couldn't call you because you were on something else like Telstra. That's how healthcare communication goes, at least in Australia and New Zealand. There's other legacy stuff, like there's only, in the GP world, only about 10% of clinics, like their practice management systems, the electronic record that holds all the patient information, only about 10% of those are actually cloud-based. The other 90% are still server-based, like local installs. And so, servers sitting under desks or within rooms that mean that they're just like beacons of information and not connecting to anything else, but also, honeypots of information that are easily hackable and prone to being locked out, and just so many issues with that, right? So, but there has been, not through a shortage or of attempts from these vendors to try and build cloud solutions to bring the whole, industry on. But I think as an industry, there's been a lot of challenge in bringing clinicians from server to cloud and trying to justify that, and then getting over firstly, the education of what that means, but secondly, also what like those risks are and how to mitigate for them. So there's just so much like we need to be able to crawl before we can walk and run here, and it's so much slower in healthcare in Australia. And I know these issues are similar in other parts of the world, but particularly in Australia, some of these basic fundamental legacy things are such a prevalent issue that is slowing a lot of things down in innovation in healthcare.
With this 10% that you mentioned, do they tend to be big companies because they
No.
have more budget?
No. Like the big companies are the ones still with they've got their own setups within their own servers and everything that are connected in that sense. But cloud adoption often, at least within the primary care setting, it's more so maybe some new innovative clinics that have been built, typically those that have multidisciplinary type services. So they've got maybe a GP and a physio and something else all in the same place that would make sense to all be connected. And so they see the benefit of having a cloud-based solution, or those providers that are doing more things remotely, like on the move, and like visiting aged care facilities with an iPad to see patients and needing to be able to access their information while there. But I mean, even then, there are a lot of providers that kind of try and work around that. So clinicians would work around that by VPNing into the clinic and accessing, remote computers and doing it that way. And they'd still prefer to do it that way than, this whole change management and adopting new technology to be able to do their work better. So it's a really fascinating space.
Yeah. I don't know if you agree with this. I think complacency also has something to do with this. I have my go to dentist, and they still use, pen and paper to schedule their appointments.
Yeah.
I briefly talked about innovation and how to automate some of their processes, and they're just not interested. It's a cash cow business for them, and they just don't want to introduce any new changes.
Yeah, right. There's so much to that. Like you look at the demographics of a lot of the clinicians. Sometimes those doctors, like the owners, might only have in their mind a couple of years left until they retire. So why would they go through this transformational change now when they're looking to wind out their career? It'll be the new crowd of clinicians that come through that are familiar with technology and comfortable with the change, and that early kind of transition piece, which is sometimes a bit difficult, but once you've undertaken that, you then reap all the benefits over a longer period of time. And like you say, nothing is on fire necessarily, and occasionally there are issues that occur, whether they're privacy breaches where local clinics' information get compromised, but generally, they're reliable systems that are on a server from a clinician's, and it's mildly annoying that the information's not available. But until there are big systemic issues that drive change that become burning platforms, then it's hard to see how the industry is going to move en masse.
Yeah. So basically, people are comfortable.
Yeah, exactly.
Comfortable.
Yeah.
Hey, what do you think? Which country is leading this race in terms of health tech innovation? In your mind, do you have a country or any company that you think is doing quite well in this space?
I'm really interested by what the NHS is doing in the UK around innovation and creating some urgency around some of this. So there are legislation and rules around the need to have information more interoperable. The NHS have something called NHSX, I think it is, where there's a bit more innovation and focus around the use of technology, and I think there's more awareness around evolving as an industry using technology in that space. So I think that's really encouraging coming from a large health system like the NHS to be doing things like that. It's not perfect by all means, but there's some interesting stuff coming out of there. It's funny, I know a lot of people look to Australia and say, hey, they're doing some great things here too. So it's always, grass is always greener on the other side, right? But there's always some, interesting stuff happening in, smaller places like Norway and Sweden and everything, but I haven't really got any specific examples there. I think generally, Australia does pretty well, all things considered. And, you look at the response to COVID and how we've handled things generally compared to other parts. This is that middle ground. I think we're okay and we're doing all right and we can get by. But if we want transformational innovation, then we really need to be looking at doing things a little bit differently. So that's where I think on the matter.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm currently working on a project with a large metro company, and I think there's a lot of similarities with the pain points that you share during our podcast today. They're trying to test out blockchain to build out a ecosystem with their suppliers, and they've got over 10,000 suppliers. The challenging part is to, I think, very similar to the health tech industry. How do we get the rest of the people on board with the same technology so that everything is interoperable? That's one of the key questions, the management is asking, right?
Yeah, man. Like it's funny you said blockchain. Like it depends who you ask, but potentially blockchain has a really good opportunity to solve a lot of the problems around interoperability and security. But there's just no way, given the current situation of fax machines and local servers, that we're at that
Yep.
point yet, So that's going to be at some point where we will end up this whole concept of not just for the security side and access and interoperability of it, but also the patient ownership aspect of it too. I think is going to be really interesting when it comes to blockchain, when it eventually makes its way down to healthcare and in normality. But the ability for healthcare providers, rather than a patient's information being the custodian of that being the healthcare provider, it'll be the individual providing access to providers, which is where a lot of people see it needs to be one day, but we're just so far from that right now.
Where are we in terms of the percentile?
But this is the thing, where it's just so early. Before we get to that point around blockchain, I've seen only this week, I know of a couple of operators within Australia focused on blockchain and healthcare who have closed down their, or at least put on ice their solutions for a number of years until the industry gets to a point where it can even fathom some of these concepts, because healthcare in Australia, like I said before, we're still at this stage where we're working out what cloud is and how to get off fax machines. So we're in the individual percentages, if we're putting it that way.
Yeah. You need another 2 to 3 more significant events like COVID to really push these changes along.
I think, COVID being a perfect example of the implementation of telehealth will thrust into that, and that's, that'll be helpful for further innovation. But we saw, and we've seen other things too. Within the GP space, there's been the adoption of online appointments, and that was a more organic thing where it was, when that was an early idea, that was seen as kind of a novel concept, and people weren't sure whether that would take off. Now it's kind of commonplace now to book an appointment online with your GP as opposed to picking up the phone, although it depends where you are. So, there's still some work to be done. I think after COVID and in Australia, the common phrase is, we advanced 10 years in 10 days, and everyone said that a lot. I think that there's so much more to telehealth though. There's more than just being able to speak to a doctor on the video or, on a telephone. There's all these cool things like remote monitoring and hospital in the home and the ability to do things when a patient's in hospital, they're not necessarily physically in the hospital. That I think opens up, some solutions for some problems that we've had in Australia for a long time. Like I mentioned before around the fact we're a very dispersed nation, large country, big remote areas. There's a lot of opportunity there to solve some problems.
Yeah, I like a lot of the examples that you just shared, and I think a lot of them are related to sort of process innovation, if I may. They're not really fundamentally changing how the industry operates. And I recently read a report from McKinsey. I think the COVID has actually accelerated digital product adoption in a lot of obviously developed and developing countries. In particular, I think what we've seen in developing countries is that the acceleration has leapfrogged 10 years. I don't know if you've seen sort of similar pace in Australia because of COVID.
I think what we've seen the increase of is the adoption of these technologies, and the innovation by those players have been there for a little bit. I think that it's forced others to be in it, I think with the adoption, it's forced the need, and what's been good is it's demonstrated that it's a viable solution. So for all indications suggest that telehealth is here to stay in Australia and will be continued to be funded by the Australian government. And I think that's
where your taxes go, eh?
Yeah, that's right. Well, but it's not like it's not like the Australian government has said it's definitely here to stay. Like they say that, then they say it's been extended until December. It's like, well, everyone's waiting for it to be part and parcel now, and every indication suggests it will be. It's just not. We just seem to be deferring it. So I think we'll get there, but there's still a lot of kind of way to go. I think it's promising seeing that in other areas, like seeing in the public health setting, public hospitals are a little bit more willing to engage with early stage startups or innovative companies and partnering in that sense. Like I said, there's still a lot of way to go in that. I think a big problem to solve in that space is the collaboration in the industry, hence why starting Talking HealthTech, and we've got this good community of individuals that operate in the space, hopefully coming together, building some relationships, and then using that as a platform to do some really amazing things.
Yeah. And I mean, sadly, to do a radical change like that at an industry level, you really got to have a visionary to really sort of comes out and say, we got to do this and we're committed to the change.
Yeah, like we were speaking in an episode this morning, funnily enough, is about why, say, the big enterprises or government bodies don't adopt innovative technology more. And often it's about if you're a CTO, it's rare that the CTO is going to get fired for hiring Microsoft, but they'll be fired for hiring like the early stage startup that they gave a chance to solve a innovative problem with something like blockchain or something like that. Like even after going through all the due diligence and all of the requirements, but if you're not a big, well-established organization, it can be not hard to do, but like to build that trust of the individual that's going to back you. So it does come down in these organizations, even though they're big, scary institutions or organizations, it sometimes comes down to that one CTO or CIO or decision maker that had the confidence, the vision to see what the possibility could be. And that really makes a change.
Yep. And really have a sort of fail fast culture and to encourage, taking more risks at an organizational level.
Yeah, okay. To feel safe to be able to make those decisions.
Yeah. Well, I think that's going to take time. I've got one last question for you, Pete. Where are the opportunities? What's coming next?
I think a lot of the opportunities exist in like centralizing a lot of the data. Like when I talk about healthcare, I talk about bringing all these bits of information together and not increasing this dispersing all the information across different silos. So there's some great innovative solutions coming, but if they're not built on standards or in a way that allows them to be interoperable, it's just creating more and more hassle. So I think the opportunity that exists really is in the utilization and the secure sharing of data to help, as an industry, the collective all come together and solve things that way for patients, for institutions, for everything. I don't think one organization or one person can do it alone. I think it's going to require a community of an industry to come together and allow things like to be more interoperable, to allow better connectivity, all of these things that are really important with these technologies. Because there's some pretty cool stuff coming out, and pretty innovative things that allow patients to monitor information and collect more information than ever from their home and do things in real time and have things measured. But a lot of the time it's about asking why we're doing it and what we're going to do with it. So I think that at a foundation, a lot of that kind of connectivity and the interoperable nature of all this information would be really important to help us solve things at a bigger scale.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Where can people find you, Peter?
Check out talkinghealthtech.com, and we've got all the socials. I'm mostly on LinkedIn, so check me out there. Thanks so much, Aaron.
Stay safe, and thank you, Peter.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Transformative Purpose. In each episode, we talk to inspirational people who are making our world better. Make sure to like, rate, and review. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from the show, and we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, if you have questions or feedback, you can reach out at aaronpeng.co.